Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Today's webinar will be on advanced features and workflow improvements, part two, using Clip Studio Paint, and it will be presented by PJ Holden. Before we begin the webinar, there are a few housekeeping items I'd like to share with you. The webinar will be approximately 1 hour long. All attendees will be muted. The Q&A session will be during the last 15 minutes of the webinar. Attendees can ask questions in the GoToWebinar question box right away. Due to time constraints, not all questions will be answered. The webinar will be recorded, and the recording will be available on social media and will be sent via email to all registrants as well as attendees. Today's panelists are Fahim Niaz, myself, Joanna Brower from Celsius, and the presenter, PJ Holden. For those of you who are joining us for the very first time, Clip Studio Paint is your all-in-one solution for stunning, ready-to-publish illustrations, comics, manga, and animations. For more information, please check us out at clipstudio.net/en, as well as at graphicsly.com. And with that, we'll be passing the reins of the webinar over to PJ, where he'll begin his demonstration.
Hi, my name is PJ Holden. I'm a comic artist best known for my work on Judge Dredd for 2000 AD and doing World of Tanks with Garth Ennis for Dark Horse. And I'm currently in the middle of drawing a very, very big graphic novel with Garth. So we've already done one webinar before with Kelsis and Graphicsly that covered some of what I kind of rather cheekily called advanced techniques and advanced skills. And really what they are is I think an awful lot of artists kind of they use Clip Studio as part of their workflow, and when they get into that workflow they kind of don't explore the other options. They don't kind of tend to look for easier ways to do things. They find the track that they want to go down and will often kind of stick to those tools that they use without ever exploring beyond that, because that takes time. It takes time to find those things. As it happens, my background's in IT. Before becoming a comic artist, I worked for 20 years in the IT industry. I trained people, I wrote software, I did all sorts of things. And because of that, I tend to explore things. I tend to, when I've got software like Clip Studio, I'll tend to go through it and start exploring things. And that's kind of led me to find what I think are some of the faster ways to do some of the things. So some of the things that we would do frequently as a comic artist, I've kind of I think I've discovered some of the faster ways of doing that. Every tool in Clip Studio tends to have a multitude of options and lots of different ways of doing it. And so I kind of have been working on the basis of what's the best, which is the fastest ones of these that I can work with. So what I'm going to talk about today is generally my workflow. I tend to go from I do layouts usually on the computer now. I'll do sort of a rough layout, that a little thumbnail drawing. I'll then draw the pencils on paper, just traditional pencil and paper drawing. And what that does, that just allows me to freely draw without kind of thinking about computers and without thinking about, I like the silence of paper. I like the noise that comes from the scratching of paper. So I tend to draw pencil like that. And I won't even mark out the page very accurately. I'll just get a rough notion of where the page is and where the document size is, and then I'll scan that paper in that pencil page, and that's when I'll start adding panel borders and so on within the computer, because adding panel borders in Clip Studio is so much faster than doing it by hand. And I'll then print that out. I'll print that out in a way that allows me to ink over that artwork and scan the artwork ink into the computer, and then I can tidy that up. And so I'm going to talk about that process and how I do that. It sounds time consuming, and I think the reason it sounds time consuming is because there are multiple steps in there. There's pencil scanned, digital bits, print out, scan, ink it, scan, and then tidy up. And so that sounds like there's a lot of steps in that, but it's actually quite a fast process, and it frequently is faster than doing everything on paper or doing everything digitally. Because what I'm really doing is I'm using the best tools for the job, I think, or at least the tools I'm most comfortable with. So penciling, I find, is just so much freer on a sheet of paper, or can be. And I can do that anywhere. I don't need to take I have a 27-inch Cintiq, which you're seeing right now. I don't need to take that anywhere with me. I can just use a notepad or something and just start scribbling out ideas for a page, and I can scan that into the computer and then start tidying it up and doing all the kind of more labor intensive stuff like panel borders within the computer. So I've got a document here. It's a strip I co-wrote and drew called Terran Omega with a friend of mine, Scott Ferguson, which is a kind of cool little sci-fi strip. You'll see here I'm actually using Clip Studio EX. So there are, I think, two versions of Clip Studio Pro and Clip Studio EX. The primary difference between them is the EX allows you to have multi-page documents. Now, multi-page documents incredibly handy because it allows you to have, as you can see here, I'll just shrink these down so you can see them. It allows me to have all of my documents in one location. I don't need to worry about folders. All of the documents associated with this comic strip are in this one location, and it allows me to set up a single document size for one page, and then every time I add a brand new page it just maintains the exact same document size, and that's extremely handy. The other thing it allows me to do is it allows me to join two pages together to have a double page spread. So what I'm going to talk about is right now I'm just going to create a blank page here so we can actually do some things with it. I just add a nice little blank page there. And we'll go in and I'm going to describe, I think one of the things that people get confused about on Clip Studio is almost practically the first thing you have to do, which is create a new document. Clip Studio has a multitude of options here, which can be a bit sort of baffling when you look at them. You're sort of overwhelmed by all of these things. It does have certain default settings that you can use, and it's actually much stronger on manga settings than it is on US or American comics, but it's got a whole bunch of sort of paper sizes, but sometimes you'll want to create your own. And it's also handy to sort of understand what all of these things are, so I'm going to talk about those. But first of all, I'm going to go back to what would normally happen in traditional print. Traditional print, if you are working with a publisher, they will describe a document and they'll describe it as having what's called so you'll hear the words trim, trim size, bleed, and safe area. Okay, so to give you a sense of what that means, that basically means that any comic page that gets printed has a safe area, and anything that appears in this safe area will definitely see print. It is the safe area, and then within that safe area you'll have your text balloons and so on. You'll have any important things that you want to see. You'll basically have everything that is important to the comic is going to be in here, and safe areas, you know, your panel shapes would all typically be in there. If you can imagine, there's the borders of a printed page. That's a printed comic page, and there's little staples in there just to give you a sense of what that looks like. So that safe area looks like that. Now, outside of the safe area, you will have a trim and a bleed area. A bleed area is basically an area that is typically the widest boundaries of a page of artwork. So in other words, the safe area is the bleed area is if you want some artwork to appear right on the edge of a page here. So, you know, for example, if you've got a galaxy or something and you want the sun to appear there, what you've got to do is draw right up to the into the bleed. Okay, and the bleed, as I say, typically goes beyond where the physical page would print, but the reason for that is that it's going to cut that off. And so if you don't draw all the way to the edge, there's a chance you might get these funny little sort of lines where the comic is trimmed. So what you've got then is this area here is the bleed, and then you've got a trim area, and the trim area is generally a kind of, there's usually a margin of a little sort of margin where this trim area might be, because the trim is where the physical process of the printing mechanism is used to cut the paper. So it will typically cut it around, you know, sometimes it'll cut it right at one extreme of that bleed, and sometimes that trim, and sometimes it'll cut it at the other extreme of the trim. So you need to have artwork that fills that gap there in order to make sure that you actually bleed off the page. So it's a little confusing, I think, because people use the expression to bleed off the page to mean to kind of have artwork that sort of goes off the page totally, and then you've got the bleed area, which is often a little bit of artwork that's lost, that's cut off. So you don't put anything important in there, but you do still have to draw it, because if you don't draw it and the artwork gets trimmed, what can happen is that you can see where you've stopped drawing. You can see those end bits, and sometimes you can actually see that in printed comics. So that sort of explains the traditional printed process. So just to go over that again, you've got bleed, and you've got trim, and you've got safe. Now those are the terms that are used in publishing comics in the UK and in America. So your bleeds your sort of far bit there, and let's go with trim is this area that would be cut out within that, and then your safe area, which is green, just to show you what the safe area. The safe area is where your comic is absolutely going to be safe. And so a typical comic would be, let's fade that down a bit. A typical comic might have a panel that goes a nice full bleed panel here, you'll have a character here, and you'll have another person there, and so on, blah blah blah, and so on. Now, Clip Studio uses the same, it uses slightly different words to describe exactly the same thing, but it also introduces another feature, and that other feature is the canvas. And the canvas is basically bleed, trim and safe are all about the printed process and where the artwork's going to appear on the page. The canvas is about where your artwork is drawn. So the canvas actually extends outside of the bleed, and it gives you this kind of canvas area that isn't generally used by publishers, but it can be used by artists. So you can put extra information in there, you can put your story title and so on. All of that can be automated. Now if you find this very confusing, and it can be very confusing, sometimes it's best just to ignore the canvas and just use bleed, trim and safe areas, because that at least cuts it down in complexity. And I'll show you roughly how this maps up here on a brand new document. So you'll see this little, hopefully you can see this little sort of diagram here. And that sort of shows you what this thing will look like. Let's go for A4. So you'll see there, there's the safe area is marked out here, and then the bleed and the trim, and then this wider area is the canvas, and that tallies up to the word canvas here is this big page. And then you've got manga, what they call manga draft settings here. You've got a binding size, finish size, which is this sort of inner bit. The inner bit, which kind of roughly translates to where the bleed would be, and the trim. And then you've got the safe area. So this default border inner size is actually that safe area. And then the binding finish size is this trim and bleed combined. So it uses a single size, but then it also a bleed width. In other words, if the size is 210, then in 5 millimeters within that is the bleed area. So that's just to give you some, it is kind of complex, hard to wrap your head around, but hopefully you can sort of understand what those numbers mean. On the EX version of Clip Studio, you also have this option to add multiple pages. I'll quickly go through that because that has a couple of confusing options there. Multiple pages basically lets you set up a multi-page document. You've got some extra features in here. A binding point and a start page. The binding point and the start page describe where the staples are going to be on your paper. So if you imagine, even if you lift up a comic and open it up to that very first page of the comic, and you'll see the first page on a European or American comic, the first page is actually on the right hand side. The staples are on the left hand side of that first page. So that basically maps to binding point, left binding. So for European comics, it's left binding, and start pages from the right. For manga, Japanese, Chinese comics, and I'm sure others, your binding is the other way around. It's your binding is on the right hand side, your staples are on the right hand side, and the first page you read is on the left. But for UK comics, it's left binding from right. And that, I'll create a very simple small document here just to let you see what that's going to look like. If you're creating a multi-page document, one of the other first things you've got to do is you've got to actually tell it which folder, which directory you're going to create this in, because it basically wants to keep a multi-page document is multiple single pages, so it wants to know where you're going to keep all of these single pages because it's going to create them all for you. So let's call this my comic, and it'll just create that. So it takes a couple of seconds to do this, and there you go. And you can see now I've got my first page. You'll see the simulation of a printed comic here. So this center area here is where the binding happens, and you'll see page 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and you'll see the safe area and the bleed, which is the outer box, and the trim area, which is this inner box, and then the canvas is the full size of that page. And that's how that all maps out. If you're exporting and your publisher doesn't want the canvas size, you can basically say don't include the canvas size in the export, just give the page to these bleed points and it will be able to do that for you. One of the great things about the multi-page documents, Clip Studio will save your preferences every so often, so let's take a wee second there, is I can combine pages. So if I want a double page spread, I can take one of these pages and then you'll see there's only some of these pages will combine. I can't combine this page and this page can't be combined, and that's because physically they can't be. There, we've basically set this up to be exactly the same as a printed thing. Physically they can't combine, but this page 2 and 3, page 1 and 2 can't combine, but page 2 and 3 can, page 4 and 5 can, page 6 and 7 can, and that's it. So if I want to join pages 6 and 7, I simply right hand click within the page view and select combine pages, and what it'll do is it'll ask me a little question about what I want to do. Do I want to delete a layer with no drawings? Yes, I do, because it's essentially merging two pages together. Do I want to align crop marks? Yes, I do, with zero gap, and that will then merge these two. So now you've got, and you'll see here even the crop marks have all changed slightly differently. You'll see that they've joined together. The page is not, it's got more canvas space left and right because it doesn't need all of this sort of dead space right in the middle. So your binding happens in the middle, and that's it's a superb way to kind of keep documents together. And then also the big benefit really is that you don't get confused over what size your document is. So I want to talk about that, but the other thing I want to talk about is layers. Now, if you've used Photoshop before, I'm sure you probably understand layers. I think in the way back in the early days, layers were one of those really baffling, complex things that certainly I didn't quite understand. But having used computers for years, I fully understand them, and I'm going to talk about them very quickly. Because I want to talk about the specifics of Clip Studio Paint and what it can do with layers. So to explain very simply, a layer, if you imagine it like a single sheet of see-through paper, so any drawings can be on that single sheet. Like that, and that's great, that's handy. That's one layer. You can have then a second layer on top of that, and your second layer, actually, in fact, we'll even do that, we'll simulate that. So that's layer one. I can create a second layer, and I'm going to draw this second layer, which is just sitting on top of that first layer, and that second layer can contain, I don't know, let's give it a little bubble there. And then whenever you combine those as a single drawing, what you end up with is one thing sat on top of the other, and it should look like something like that. Okay, so that's what they would look like combined. Layers, I try and keep the layers to a minimum because I think it can this layer area here can go very confusing very quickly. So I tend to stick to a pencil layer for pencils. And a ink layer for inks, obviously, and if I'm doing colors, I'll have what's called a flat layer, which is basically simple flat colors, and then a kind of render layer, which basically renders those colors. And so I try and stick to that number of panels, or that number of layers. Now, layers can be grouped together. If you want to keep them nice and tidy, you can create a folder, and that folder can contain layers. So there's my layers in one folder, and I can then sort of tidy those all up. So you can actually have multiple pencil layers, you can have multiple ink layers, and if you keep them in folders, it means that you can keep it all nice and tidy and nice and together. Now, the reason that you use layers, first of all, it is tidier. You can keep special effects on a certain layer, and if you make a mistake, you can just delete that special effect layer without impacting anything else. But also there's sort of slightly magical qualities each layer can have. I'll talk about the first of these. There's layer effects. Layer effects are things that happen on one layer. One of those layer effects, and possibly the most useful for a comic artist, is layer color. And what you can do is when you press that layer color, it will change the color of the layer, all of the layer. So if I do that, you can see now that layer there becomes a blue. And that's, I can change the color of that. I can change that to kind of lighter blue if I want there. And that's brilliant for a pencil layer. If you're doing pencils and you want to ink a pencil artwork, you can turn that off and on, and it turns off and on very quickly. There's no need to there's no, it's not actually converting it to blue. It's not converting it to any color, so the information in the computer is still exactly as it was. It's just that it is showing you it as a blue color, and I can demonstrate that if I simply, so that's a color layer, so I can actually add, I'll just add a little rainbow color in there just to very quickly to show you what happens. So that's got plenty of color on it. If I press the layer color, you'll see those colors all now convert to sort of a blue tone. I can turn that back off again, and it's great. So it's, if you're taking a photograph into the computer to trace over, you can bring a full color photograph in it, press the layer color, and suddenly it's a blue photograph you can just trace over very easily, and that's great. So some of the other effects that are there, which I'll talk about very quickly, tone converts a layer into a series of dots like that. So it'll take a color layer and turn it into black and white, and it will actually give you these kind of benday dots. So you can see there it hasn't impacted on the line art very much because the line art's already black and white. It's just slightly kind of made it slightly bumpier, but it's made a dramatic impact on this tone. And that, I mean, the obvious benefit of that is if you're doing a black and white comic, you can actually create a single layer that has all of these tones in it, and anything you paint. So if I take one of these, let's go with a smooth watercolor. I can paint in watercolor. If I turn that off, you can see I'm sort of painting now. I could paint around this face like this, and then when I press the tone button, you'll see it gains these little tones that are sort of lighter and darker, and it's superb for if you're doing black and white comics. This is a great feature, and you can sort of change the number of screen frequency. Screen frequency is basically how big or small those dots are, so we can change those way down to make big, nice big chunky dots like that, or way up if we want very fine dots. I actually like to see dots if I'm doing a tone in a comic with dots like that. I like the frequency to be nice and low, about 30 or so, because then it's very visual and very obvious that they're there. So you have a couple of other features. You've also this extract line, and that, turn that on. That basically tries to convert whatever you've got into a line drawn. Some things it's brilliant at, some things it's not so great at, I think, and you can play with settings there. It's not a thing we're going to use very much for what I'm talking about today, but it's there. So one of the other effects which I do like is the border effect. Border effect is a very simple feature. All it does is it draws an outline around the layer. Anything on the layer that is solid color, it will get an outline. Now I'm going to press it here, and what it'll do is it'll draw a white outline, so it won't look very different because it's white on white. But I'll do that now, and then I'll pick a color to fill it with. We'll go with orange there, and if I fill that with orange, you'll see now that the artwork has an orange outline around it. I'll just increase the size of that. Now where that's useful is if you have, say, a layer that has got a little bit of artwork that you know, if it's got a little dot of dirt on the screen on the artwork, and you can't see it, but you know it's there. I know those dots are there, but I can't see them. I can turn that on. I can instantly, they're very obvious where they are, and I can just sort of erase those very quickly. So that's useful on its own. But the other area it's quite useful in is if you're doing visual effects, if you're doing sound effects or something, it's really, I can take a pen tool and I can do kapow like that, and you can see that instantly is a really nice visual effect just using the outline. And on top of artwork, that is very readable. If I make that black, you can see that looks even better there. So you can see that's like a super fast way of doing a special effect. All I've done is selected a white drawing pen and just drawn very simply on the layer. Now if I turn the outline off, the edge color off again like that, it will look like that artwork is going to disappear because I've drawn white on top of white, but that's because the paper color is white. The paper color is interesting. Every new page in Clip Studio has a paper layer. The paper layer is, if you don't have the paper layer, you'll get this, which is transparent. So you'll see that the artwork is all black and white on a transparency, and the paper just sort of tidies up that transparency. But you can actually change the paper color. If you're drawing black and white comics and you find the screen a little harsh, you can change the paper color like that, and you'll see now that's sort of darkened everything down a little bit, which is a little easier on the eye maybe. Certainly for some, if you have a big screen, that's a kind of more comfortable way to look at that artwork, and it can be very quickly turned back just to white again. So that's a nice little feature. So those are the effects. Now there are other features within a layer. A layer has other attributes, as it were, attributes that are unique to layers and are useful for other things. So I'm going to talk a little bit about those. So some of those attributes are accessible along here, along this sort of layer bar. You can lock a layer. That basically says I can't move anything or change anything on this layer. I can't draw on this layer. If I attempt to draw on it, you'll see there's a little cross thing saying nope. And that's great if you've got a layer that you want to keep. You know it's set in stone. You don't want to accidentally draw on it. You can lock the transparency of it. In other words, if I draw on this layer, I've locked the transparency. If I draw on this layer, let's draw with a red color, and attempt to draw on it, so I'm going to draw there. So that's part of the artwork that I've already drawn, and that's okay. But if I attempt to draw outside of that on the transparency, so I'll show you where the transparency again is. If I attempt to draw on the transparency, nothing will happen. It will not let me draw on that transparency. So I can actually just, I can do that, and that's great if, say, you want to recolor some artwork or do something slightly different with it. So I mean, a useful feature of that is to take a piece of line art and decide that you're going to color the line art. You're going to add red, you're going to add red or blue or whatever it is that you're going to add to the line art. And you can do that by simply locking the transparency and then drawing over it. So one of the other features of it is this little icon that looks like a pencil. And what that does is it tells Clip Studio that this layer is now a draft layer. And what that means is you might know it's a pencil layer. Personally, you might realize, well, I know I've got some pencils in this comic and this is a pencil layer, but Clip Studio doesn't really know that. It has no way of telling that what you're doing is a pencil layer or something else. And by tapping that little icon, it's telling Clip Studio that this is a pencil layer. And what that means is that you can use some of these tools in Clip Studio that will actually ignore pencil layers. So for example, you can have a fill refer other layers here, which basically means if I fill on something, I'll check every single layer. So let's add a couple of I'll add a couple of layers and we'll call them ink. Inks 1, inks 2. So, and then we'll just give this the name pencils, just so I don't get confused. So on my pencil layer, I'm going to draw like a shape. Oh, let's turn that outline off. I'm going to draw a little shape on the pencil layer. Let's make that a little star shape. Okay, so that's a star I've drawn on the pencil layer. So if I set colors on the pencil layer, you'll see that straight away. This ink layer, I'm going to draw a box around it. Okay, so now again, that's the pencil layer. The box is drawn on the ink layer. Now if I go to fill, my fill tool here, and refer only to editing layers, well actually what we'll do is I'll add another layer here. We'll add a second, we've got a second inks layer, and what I'll do is I'll draw another shape only on this layer. So this is only on this layer right there. So if I can color that as well. Let's give that a red color just to indicate that it's an ink. So that's two ink layers I've got now, and I've got a pencil layer. If I go to fill and refer only to editing layer, that means if I press the fill on this layer anywhere on here, if I tried to fill within this little corner here, say I want to very specifically fill this corner, and try and fill it here using the refer only to editing layer, it will ignore the layer below and it will only fill within the layer that I've got here, the red layer. So let's undo that. It's acting as if these other layers don't exist, basically. Now that is great, but sometimes what you want to do is you actually want to fill, you want to make sure you know about these other layers. So I can do this option that says refer to other layers, and what that does is when I go to fill here, it will actually see that there's a boundary there, and it'll fill in only to that boundary. So you can see that's worked quite well. Now one of the things it does that's really smart is it will actually ignore a pencil layer. So if I'm going to stop this being a pencil layer for a second and show you what happens when I fill here. So if I fill here, you'll see it fills up to that triangle, or that star. If I turn that layer back to draft layer and go back to fill that in, it actually will ignore that layer all together and fill in. And you can tell, I mean, if you were dealing with pencils and you were inking digitally on the computer, you can instantly tell that's a very useful feature. That basically means that you can have your pencil layer and you can be inking over it and it will ignore what's on the pencil layer. So another thing that you can do is, I said previously that we can have a folder. The folder itself can have an indicator. It can be set as a draft layer, and what that means is that anything within that folder automatically becomes a draft layer. It sort of inherits the fact that the folder is a draft layer. So where that's useful is that you might have multiple layers that are pencils that you might want to actually keep in that one folder. It means you don't have to tell them they're all draft folders. You can just, any layer I create there becomes another draft layer. If I drag it out of there, it's no longer a draft layer. So it's a good way of kind of, if say I take a bit of artwork that I'm not very happy with, I've drawn a face or something here and I've already inked it, but I'm thinking I would like this to look better. What I can do is I can drag that down to the pencil folder that I've created, that draft folder, and that becomes now a draft layer, and I can just ink over that. The other thing that each of these inherits the properties of the folder. So if I set the folder to have a layer color of a light blue like this, you'll see those layers all now are that light blue. If I drag the layer out, you'll see that that becomes black again. If I drag it back in, that becomes blue, and now I can ink over that. So, and again, because because it's set as a draft layer, if I were to fill this in, it would fill in and ignore basically what's there. If that wasn't a draft layer, let's drag that out just to reconfirm. So that's not a draft layer, although I will set it blue. If I tried to fill in, you'll see it goes to where that blue is, because the blue is, it's basically using the blue as a way to say, oh no, there's a line there. It's using that layer and going, nope, there's a line on that. But because the layer is in that folder, it ignores the layer altogether. So I can just keep drawing like that, and that's kind of, it's how I work. I mean, I'll scan in artwork and I'll keep it in a draft folder like that, so that the software knows that it's a draft layer. The other thing that this is useful for is that it's not just the drawing tools. The drawing tools and the selection tools, all of these tools and their sub-tools can all kind of ignore the draft folder or the draft layers, or they can be set to kind of do something with the draft layers. But you can also do things like, if you're going to export a file from this, you can say, let's export that, and you can say, I want to exclude the pencils, I want to exclude the draft layers, and we'll get a little preview here, and you'll see that's excluded all of those other layers because they were all draft layers. And that's great if you're working with collaborators and you're working with other artists and you want to send them what the inks of the artwork looks like without sending them the pencils. You can do that. If you want to send them the pencils, you can do the same thing. I can, again, exactly the same way, I can go into the export, tell it I want to include the draft, click OK, and now you can see the draft is included. And again, this works with pencils, it works with exporting, but it also works with printing. You can specify to include or exclude the draft when you're going to print, so that you can always kind of have full control over what it is you're doing. So to go back, now we've kind of explored all of that, I want to put that together with how it all works, how I work. So I'm going to go, this is the comic Terran Omega that I started with. I'm going to go into this image here. Now this is a pencil scan, but I'm going to show you how I get to there. What I do is I'll usually use File, Import, Scan. Now I have a lovely big A3 scanner, so I can scan in a full page at one time, but you can, if you have a smaller scanner, you can scan them in and splice them together. I did that for years and years and years, so I know the pain of trying to cut that artwork together. I'm not going to show you the interface for the scanner because it's going to be different than everyone's scanner, but once artwork's scanned into the computer, it looks like this. This is a grayscale scan, a true grayscale. Most scanners will have three options. They'll have grayscale, black and white, or color. Sometimes they'll have more. One of them might be sort of a dither or something like that, but they boil down to grayscale, black and white, and color. Grayscale means bring it in with all the grays, and that's great for pencils. Black and white means bring in black and white artwork, and that's great for optical character recognition. It's great for text, but it's also great for line art, comic book line art. It's not great if you're an artist who's using grey wash in your artwork, in which case you've generally got to bring it in as grayscale. And it's not great if you're a painter and you want to bring a painting in, you've got to scan it in as full color. But once it's bought in, Clip Studio brings artwork in from the scanner and from image import in this as an image type. It's basically slightly different than a proper layer, and there's a couple of steps you need to go through to convert it to something that you can deal with and you can edit. And what I'm going to show you, and we covered this a lot in the first webinar we did, which was the creation of auto actions. Auto actions are a way to record a bunch of steps so that you can replay those actions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do exactly the same thing again. I'm going to create an auto action for the steps that I take when I've scanned in some pencils, just to show you how easy this is. So I'm going to go to Window Auto Action. That shows me my auto actions I've already got. So I'm going to drag this over here so you can see these slightly more clearer. I'm going to create a brand new auto action. You can, if you want to keep things tidy, you can have your own set of auto actions. You can actually, you can download auto actions from other people. I'm going to create just a new auto action here. So, and we'll call this Clean Up Pencils. Pencil scans. Okay, so that's the name of it. Now it's not going to record anything until I press this record button, and when it records, what it'll do is it'll record each step-by-step thing I do. So if I do a thing and undo, what it records is it records the thing and it records that I've done an undo, but it records both those steps. So if you do too many things and you undo and so on, you can go in and tidy it up afterwards, so that you don't sort of step through 20 things when you only meant to do 3. So I'm going to start record, and I'll talk through the things that I need to do on this. So there's a couple of things. First of all, you'll see this does not look like grayscale. What this is right now is dithered, because it comes in with screen tone set on. If you scan in an image or import a file image, it comes in with screen tone set on. But I mean, we just turn that off. That's as simple as that. And now we've got the artwork. Now this isn't too bad, but often the artwork I will scan in will be a little too light, because I used a pencil with a 2H pencil, and it's quite light. So the next step is to really kind of darken this down. And the process I do for this, there's lots of different ways of doing this, but actually one step before that is, because it's still an image and it's not a proper layer within Clip Studio, it's an image, and you can tell by that little picture icon it's got. The next thing I've got to really do is rasterize the image, and all that does is it converts it to a layer that you can then do stuff with. So I'm going to rasterize that. That takes a little second, and again you'll see over here at auto actions it saved that step. So then essentially I'm doing these bunch of steps, and the next time I scan in a pencil drawing, I can just run this auto action and it'll do all these steps for me. So the next thing I want to do is darken it down a little bit, so I can go to tonal correction. And there's lots of options here. You can use brightness and contrast to do it. You can use posterization to do it by playing with it a little bit. You can use level correction to change the levels of the colors within it. All of these will work. The method I tend to go for is tone curve, and it's because it gives you this sort of representation of what colors there are here. I just grab this little thing and get a simple curve like that, and you see straight away that's made a big difference. That's as dark as an inked bit of artwork now, and I can just OK. Now it's not an inked bit of artwork, it is just grayscale. So there's a couple of other steps. I also will rename it. I tend to name it pencils. I will set it as a draft layer, so Clip Studio knows this is a pencil layer, because even though I've called it pencils, it doesn't realize I intend for this to be a pencil layer. The other thing I'll do is I'll change the layer color. So I'll go in, so the layer color by default is this kind of blue, and I actually want what comic artists have used for decades, this color that's referred to as non-repro blue. It's basically a very light cyan, and what happens is anything scanned into a computer as black and white, or if it's processed through a photocopier, if you use this very light kind of cyan color, that cyan color disappears. It vanishes. The printer ignores it, which is why it's called non-repro, as in no reproduction. It does not reproduce. It's called blue, but it's kind of a cyan color. So I set that to this, which is like that, and then I actually turn it off because I still want to see the pencils. But what it's done is it's changed the anytime I press that button, it will be that blue now. So I'll stop that, I'll stop my auto action because those are the steps. Those are a perfect amount of steps I want. Now there's a couple of little tricks in here. One is that I can go in and delete any of these little steps by just dragging them down to the bin. The other thing is some of these steps have so the tick box here, this first tick box says yes, do this. In these steps, yes, do this. I can say no, let's not do that. Let's ignore this step. Let's not set that to a draft layer. So it'll basically step through all of these and not set that. Now sometimes some of these things actually rely on the previous thing being done. So generally, if you've done it all, you'll often want to keep all of those. But some of these steps, tone curve. So the next time I run this, it will not ask, it'll not show me that little, it'll not show me this. I'll show you it again so you can see what I'm talking about. It won't show me this tone curve dialog box. It won't show me that. What it'll do is it'll just use the settings I used the last time because that's what it's going to save. And change layer name. It won't ask me what the layer name is. It will just change it to what I changed it to before. Now, these have a little extra box beside them. Some of these options have this little extra box, and what this extra box means is I want to see the dialog box for this. In other words, even though the last time I called it pencils, the next time you run, I want you to stop and ask me what you want to call this layer, and that can be useful if you're dealing with different kinds of, if you're dealing with multiple pencil scans. Maybe you've got 3 or 4 pages that have to be assembled in the computer together, so you can have one called pencils 1, one called pencils 2, and one called, section that I missed out on, and you can just turn that dialog box off and on. So if you turn that dialog box on like this, it'll ask you every time. If you turn it off, it won't ask you anymore. So that's what I do with pencils. Now, the next stage for me is to create a frame folder. Frame folders are that area that, put away my auto actions. Frame folders are the way that you draw panel borders in Clip Studio. Frame folders are great for that. They are super fast for that. What I'll do first of all is, because this setup of Clip Studio is a completely blank setup, I set it up clean, so you should be seeing, everyone should have seen this Clip Studio looking a bit like this at some stage. But what I'm going to do is a couple of things in preference which I like to set on any new installation, which I think are very, very useful for everyone. Again, I covered some of these in the first webinar that we did. So the very first thing I always change is the ruler unit measurements. The unit of length is always set to pixel by default on a new install. I always change that to millimeter, always change it to millimeter. And the reason for that is that the pen measurements are all done within unit of length measurements. So when you look at a pen that says 5, if the unit of length measurements is in pixels, it's 5 pixels. If you look at it and it says 5 and the unit of length measurements in millimeters, it means 5 millimeters. And that means that it's resolution independent. It means that if you do a page that's 300 dots per inch, or a page that's 900 dots per inch, or a page that's 72 dots per inch, and you use unit of length in millimeters, then you will have exactly the same size of pen. It's just changing the amount of millimeters. It's doing these little calculations for you behind the scenes that you don't see and don't need to worry about. If you leave the unit of length on pixels, it will not do that for you. So I've met people who have kind of for years never quite understood why their pen sizes were not the same as millimeters, and it's because of this section in preferences. So I set that. So the next thing I do as well is I'm going to click OK, so that sets that. The next thing I often change is frames have a couple of default settings. The frames will have a gutter, and that gutter is set here for all of them. Vertical gutter and horizontal gutter. I like a 5mm gutter. Again, if we had unit of measurements in pixels, I would have had to specify that by pixels, and I mean I can't wrap my head around what size a pixel is in the computer, so it's much easier to set it to millimeters, because then if I print that out, it will be 5 millimeters. If it's 600 pixels, I don't know if I'm going to get 5 millimeters or 10 millimeters or some other figure. So I set that to millimeters there. Or 5 millimeters, and that's a good kind of setting, a good default setting. Let me create a new layer, and we have a frame border folder. So the frame border folder has a couple of things to it. There's a couple of sort of settings. Part of it is the line width. The line width is how thick the border is that's drawn on the page. So I'm going to set that to 1.4. And there we go. And you can see this, we've created this frame border, and it's a nice thick chunky border. It surrounds all of the artwork. By default it goes to the entirety of the safe area of the artwork, and we might want to change that. So what we're going to do is what we'll do is I'll now splice this up into different panels. So I'll use the divide frame border. Frame borders can be divided by frame folders and borders. So a slight diversion is I'm going to talk about what that means. So I'm going to go into, I'll just go into a nice blank page here just to explain that. There we go. So there are three parts to a frame folder. One is the border. The border is the black lines that you see. So those are lines that are drawn sort of magically by the software wherever your panel borders are. And you can actually have, you saw there are thick panel borders, but you can have a single page might have all sorts of different panel borders within it that you can sort of specify. You're not limited to just having purely straight. You can actually have overlapping ones, you can have circular shaped ones, all sorts of things. But the second thing that a frame folder is an actual folder. So similar to how the other ones were, how I showed you the folders earlier on, it contains, you can put your images within a folder. And the third thing that it has is it has a mask, and the mask basically is this area of the artwork that you will want to hide, and that very sensibly is, I mean, you don't necessarily want to see the artwork between the gutters, for example. That would all be masked out, and so on. So if we go back to the artwork, you'll see this in a second. But so you've essentially got borders, a folder which contains each layers, so the layers, right, and then a mask, and the mask and the border are kind of joined at the hip. Basically, wherever you draw a border, it creates masks around that frame border. The folder, there's two options here. One is to kind of just keep one nice simple folder for all of your artwork and all of the borders. So when you split it all up, you get one single folder. The other option you can do is actually every time you split up a panel is to create a brand new folder. So every time I split a panel in half and just draw a magic line down the middle, I could end up with frame folder 1 and frame folder 2, and that would be 1 and that would be 2, and they are basically identical to each other, except this one has a mask that surrounds it and this one has a mask that surrounds it. So that means you can keep your artwork all tidied up and all together in each of those folders. Now for me personally, that means you end up with hundreds and hundreds of folders, and I don't always want to do that, so I try and kind of minimize the amount of folders I've got. So let's go back in here and I'll show you how that actually translates. So if I take the pencil layer and drag it into the frame folder, you see the purpley blue color here is a mask. If I take this pencils in, right now the pencil folder and the frame folder are they're on top of each other, but the pencil folder is not inside the frame folder. But if I drag it inside, you'll see that the mask suddenly applies and that the artwork outside of, which we saw a second ago, so I'll drag it back out to show you, that artwork that's outside in this blue area will get cut off. And that could be great, that could be exactly what you want. It's not how I like to work. I like to work that I can sort of see all of my artwork, but that's how some people will work. So we'll take this, by default the space of frame border is set to what the preference settings were, but it doesn't actually take them from the preference unless you tick that box there. So I can now do that, and if I just use that tool, you'll see it comes up with a border there. If I hold the shift key, it'll lock it into position, so I can just lock it into horizontal and vertical position. So let's do that, and you'll see what's happening there is you can see a little icon representing where the mask is, and I can very quickly just split that across like that, and you'll see that's very nice and neat and tidy. I've got one folder which has got my panel in it, and I've got a pencil layer within that, and this has got my frame borders and so on. I can play around with these and resize them and so on, and it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 panels, and that's great. Now the alternative way of using the frame folder is to actually divide them by the frame folder, so the same thing, and what you'll see happening is now there is 2 frame folders, and the second one has they have individual masks, and I can do that, and I do that, and that, and now I've got one frame folder for every single image, and it's, for me, it's a little hard to manage it. It's just quite a lot going on. If you're the kind of artist that likes to work on individual images, it's probably great because it means I can just concentrate on this single panel without worrying, then moving on to the next one and the next one and the next one. But for me personally, that just sort of it compounds the chances of me getting things wrong. It means there's a good chance that I might accidentally draw on the wrong layer and do all sorts of things. So I just like to kind of do it this way. So we'll just split that up again. Now the reason I do all of this, because the next step in my process is to, well, what I'll do is actually, I can use the object subtool. Object subtool is a way of sort of editing sort of meta objects, things that aren't drawings, things that aren't layers really, but are other things, so 3D objects and panel borders and other things, other tools. So I can then go in and just grab these little handles and shrink and enlarge them, and you'll see as I shrink and enlarge this one, it's bringing these other ones up, which can be useful but isn't what I want to do. And the reason it's doing that is because there's a little option ticked here which is work with another frame folder, and when that option is ticked, it tries to be clever and it sort of moves the other panel borders. You can see I can move everything here, which is great, but it's not what I'm after. Let's undo, we'll go step back. So what I'll do is work with another, so if I drag that up just to show you again, so it drags up the second panel. I bring it back down. So if I turn that off, I can then just drag that up and you'll see that it doesn't do that anymore. Now it's working with a single panel. And then what I'll do is I'll take my pencil layer, I'll hit my colorize, and you'll see it'll go to that non-repro blue color that I was talking about earlier. And that now for me is ready to print. What happens is I'll print this out. I'll print this out exactly as you see it, so that I've got a black border and blue pencils. And the reason for that is it means I don't have to pencil the panel borders. What I get then is a piece of paper that has the pencils on it in blue, which means I don't need to rub anything out, and it's got the panel borders in black, which means I don't have to draw the panel borders. And I imagine it's hard to imagine that this is quicker, but it means I don't have to, like, I literally don't have to spend any time at all rubbing anything out. I don't erase my pencils. I'm a little cheap, so what I'll do is I'll flip the pencil page over and print on the reverse side of it in my printer, and that means that the artwork is all on one single page, one physical page. I don't have to spend any time at all. You saw how fast it was to create those panel borders. To do those by hand is actually for me quite difficult, because I like to measure out the panel borders to get exactly 5 mm, so I've got to physically measure out where all the panel borders are. I've got to remember where those measurements are for whenever I'm going back into the corresponding opposite point. Then I've got to pencil the panel border shapes where they're going to go, and then I've got to get my ink pen out, and which often will need cleaned because it's a repeated graph, and I might not use it. I might use it every 3 days, and so by the time the third day comes around, it's very clogged up and I've got to clean it up. So that can take an hour, that can take 20 minutes to clean up one of those, and then you've got to refill it with ink if you've run out of ink, and then you draw, and then you realize it's not that sharp and you've got to tip X out and things. So it's actually, like, it's loads faster just doing, even if you only use Clip Studio to do this one thing, this will shave hours off your working week, hours, and actually days and days and days off your working life, and a working year, it'll shave days off it, no problem whatsoever. So I'll print that out. I'll go to File, Print, Print Settings. I'll make sure that Draft is switched on, because don't forget that pencil layer there is a draft layer, and if I don't tick that box, what it'll do is it'll print the panel borders but not the pencils, so I've got to tick both. And then depending on your printer, some printers you'll need to change the settings within the printer to say I want this in color. The other thing that you might need to do is print size same as detail, scale up or down, or pixel size and so on. Scale up and down basically means shrink this. If I've drawn an A3 page and I'm printing on A4 paper, shrink it down. If I've drawn an A4 page and I'm printing on A3 paper, enlarge it. I like to, one of the things I do is the paper that I draw on, the physical paper that I draw on, I use exactly the same measurements on the digital drawings, which is one of the reasons I don't use pixel units. And what that means is that my paper is actually 1:1. I can just print that out, and it's exactly the same size it was when I penciled it. And so I'll print that out. And what I do then is just traditionally ink it, as you'd expect. So once I've done that though, I'll scan that ink in, I'm looking for my ink scan page. Here we go. I think this is it. Scanning the ink page, again it comes in exactly the same way as the previous pencil pages would do. This is scanned as pure black and white. There's a couple of differences. Very frequently most scanners will have these little smuts of dirt in them. I've enhanced the dirt in this, so there's slightly more than you might normally have, but generally my scanner will have little bits of where you've erased some artwork. You might actually, if you've used Tipp-Ex at all in the paper, you'll sometimes get little black marks. The print or the scanner itself will often catch little bits of dried ink on it, and so you will tend to get these little bits of dots and so on. I'm going to zoom right in so you can see what I'm talking about. So you can see these little tiny, that's at 200% zoom, you can see how small these little things are. So once it's scanned in, it comes in again as an image file, and again I'm going to do the same thing I did there a second ago. I'm going to create an action for this because it'll save me having to do it again. So I'm going to call this action clean up ink scan, and then I'll start recording. So the first thing I do with this is I don't need to play around with tone or anything. It's coming as a pure black and white line art. That's great. So all I really need to do is rasterize this first of all. Okay, so that rasterizes it. Now it's on the computer. Here's a grayscale. I don't want a grayscale. I want a pure black and white, pure monochrome. So I set that to monochrome. I'm going to change the name of it to inks. And then the next step here is expression color. Now, Clip Studio is unusual in that a monochrome layer actually has three types of marks that can be made on it. It can have a black mark, as you can see here. It can have a white mark, which is sort of what you're looking at here, and it can also have transparency. Now you can get a bit confused about transparency and white because the paper is white. So if I just hide the paper for the moment, or actually even better, I'll make the paper a kind of light color and hide the artwork. So you'll see my paper's pinky color, salmon pink. If I show the artwork again, you'll see that the artwork has got white on it. And the way to actually prove that is if I use the eraser and just rub that out, you'll see underneath the artwork there, that's the paper. So what I like to do though is I like my artwork to just be black, because it means then that if I'm going to color, I can color underneath it and the black artwork doesn't get interfered with. So what I do is the expression color has a little change expression color buttons here. I press the black so all we see is black. And then I can do apply expression color of preview, which basically this is just me looking at it right now. I can turn it back again, but if I just do that and then apply expression color, you'll see it'll take a wee second, and there we go. And now what we've got is a pure black line art. I can create layers underneath that, and I can add color and so on. So I've created lots of extra things in my action here which we'll delete, but that's okay. So the next step is actually cleaning up all these dirty marks. Now Clip Studio has a couple of brilliant tools for this, and they sort of depend, again, like many of Clip Studio's tools, there's lots of ways of exploring these, but the quickest way to use them is to go to Filter, Correct Drawing Line, and you've got an option that says Remove Dust, and you'll see lots of little options here. I'm going to turn off Preview, so you can see what we can do here. So preview is turned off and you'll see all the dust there. So if I turn preview on, you'll see what it does is it tidies up quite a lot of that dust. It'd be better just to zoom in a bit so you can see it a bit better. So there's the dust there, and it's saying size of dust anything less than 0.11. So we preview that and you'll see most of it disappears. Now I can go a bit braver, I can go slightly bigger than that, and you'll see most of it disappears. One danger of that is that sometimes you'll find small marks that you want to keep will also disappear. So if a character has a couple of dots for eyes, sometimes they'll vanish. So what I tend to do is err on the side of caution with this filter and go for a smaller size and just click OK. And you'll see that this page now has been nicely tidied up. There's none of those little, sometimes you'll get a little bit of dot there. And the way to fix that, I'll just stop our auto action because we've recorded everything we need now. The way to fix that is that you can now manually go in and clean up those images. You can either erase them, which is one way of doing it, or you can use in the one of the tools is Correct Line, but beside it is a Remove Dust tool. And the Remove Dust tool is exactly the same as the filter Remove Dust, except you can draw a square around whatever it is that you're trying to delete, and you can also set it much bigger. And if you set it much bigger, so for example that's too big, but that's okay because I can be quite selective where I'm going to use this. So I can use it here and go, well, there's bits of dirt there. I've got rid of that. And so that's how I tidy up my black inks. And with that, I think that's covered everything that we did on the webinar. I think there was a couple of questions that we didn't quite get to on things like inspiration and so on, which I'll answer I'll answer any YouTube questions and just reply to the YouTube questions if there is any questions. I hope you got something out of that. I'm very quickly, I think I covered lettering, so I'll quickly cover lettering. The lettering features in Clip Studio. The lettering tool has by default a single lettering subtool, which is okay. It's by default on my computer set as Tahoma. It might well be exactly the same on yours. It has a bunch of options there. What we can do with this is we can give it a font that is more appropriate. First of all, so we'll just select a font. I have a comic lettering font on here called Comic Crazy. I think you can buy fonts from all sorts of places, but the Kelsis and Graphicsly I think have font options for you. What I can do here is if I create a text drawing tool here with Comic Crazy 9 point, and I'll say hello world. There we go. That's my dialogue there. If I grab one of these little bars, which you do with the object manipulator here, you can move it around and you can shrink it and enlarge it. What that does is it will enlarge the text, which is great for sound effects, but it's not great for dialogue. Dialogue you basically want to stay at 9 point all the time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to edit some of the features of this text. So let's go back down to our text here. This is very applicable. Every subtool has an editing feature like this. So what I'm going to show you within the text subtool can more or less be replicated within all the other subtools. So it's useful to sort of, even if you're not going to letter in the software, it's useful to see where these things lie. So you've got a couple of buttons here. Well, the first thing I'm going to do is there are two buttons down below the subtool properties. One of them is edit all. Basically means let's look at every feature in this and let's edit every feature. The other button is basically reset this to where it would default to. So if I press reset, Comic Crazy will change back to Tahoma. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create Comic Crazy here again as my font of choice. Comic Crazy. Where are we? There we go. What I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate this text subtool. I'm going to call it balloon lettering. Okay. Now I can reset that back to default, and that goes back to Tahoma. My balloon lettering now is actually the default on balloon lettering is whatever the settings were on the previous tool that I copied it from. So Comic Crazy is now the default style of font for this style. But I want to change a couple of other things within the text. One of those things is the let's see, this option here, wrap text at frame. Now what wrap text at frame means is this little frame that's around the text, you can see here if I enlarge it, enlarges the text, which is great for sound effects, not great for dialogue. If I set wrap text at frame to on, like that, and what I'll do is beside that you have a couple of options. One is this little thing that gives you sort of extra options. One of them is this little visual thing. If I turn that off and on, you'll see on the property tools it shows that setting within property tools. You can do that with all of these. All of these can be set to show in the property tool settings, but we're going to do that with this one. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to register all settings to initial settings. In other words, if I reset this, wrap text at frame would turn off, but if I register this as the new default for this, wrap text would be turned on. If I reset factory setting, wrap text would be turned on. Wrap text, if I now take this tool, so that's still using the old settings, but we do another one, a brand new one. Hello, this is a dialogue test. So if I now take this, you'll see it's wrapping that text around as I move it there. So there's still things I don't quite like about that. One thing I want to do is set it to be centered aligned. So we can go in there, set alignment, and again I'll just register that to my default, and that now gives me a nice, anytime I want new dialogue I can basically, let's get rid of that. Delete with layer. delete layer. There we go. So let's go back there, and if I do quickly, we need to save the world. So you'll see that there's too much text there, the frame's too small, but I can just enlarge that frame by grabbing it and bringing it down. And you'll see it centers the text within that frame as well. And that's kind of how comic book lettering is normally done. I can then add a balloon around that. I can just go down here to balloon. The best, I mean, you can use an ellipse balloon. An ellipse balloon sort of will always give you a perfect ellipse, but it can be a little robotic looking. If we do a perfect ellipse around that, it's okay. But once you have a lot of ellipses around the page, it can feel a little kind of staid. So a slightly nicer way of doing that is to use the curve balloon, and instead of trying to build a very dramatic looking curve, what your best bet is the curve balloon lets you drop little anchor points. So if I drop a little anchor point that sort of ignoring the curve that it's making, and just imagine a square around it and draw a little square, and you'll see you've got something visually slightly more interesting looking, and we can move that. So if I use the object tool, I can move the text. Clip Studio is actually quite smart, so if I move the text over here, I can move the text anywhere I want. If I grab the balloon, it'll actually grab the balloon and the text, which means it just makes it so much easier to move things around. If I want to, with the object tool, I can grab these little bits that I drew for the curve, and I can grab them so that they can be shaped a little better. And then I can add a dialogue tail, like so. And there we go, we've got a little bit of dialogue. I don't really have time to go through a lot of the lettering tools. You can, again, as with the text there, we can create different kinds of balloon tails. This is a very simple straight one. It's actually quite good for doing this kind of visual effect as well. But you can also, have a polyline, which is a kind of a selection of straight lines, or a spline, which is a curved line. So we can do this kind of thing, like that. And if you want, you can actually, again, I can duplicate that and call it curved tail. And now this curved tail will always be this kind of tail. So the way that works is just every single tap, every time you tap once, it gives you a point on a curve, and when you want to finish, you just double tap and it'll finish. And I can go back to my balloon tail, and if I just reset the settings on the balloon tail, so now I've got a nice straight line balloon tail like that, and I've got a curved balloon tail tool as well. And as I say, every Clip Studio Paint has a similar setup. Basically every sub tool works in the same sort of way. You can go in and change the settings. In fact, I could even go into this and hide. I don't necessarily, because this is always going to be a curved tail, I can hide that setting. I can even hide that, so now I don't have any settings, which means I don't need to worry about that. I know exactly what I'm always going to get with this. It's always going to look like this, and I never have to worry about the settings. So yes, that's me. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you got something useful out of it. Excuse any ums and ahs and any coughing that I might have done on the thing. I just want to thank Fahim and Joanna from Graphicsly and Kelsis for asking me to come back and do another one. Sorry for any technical hiccups that may have occurred. I hope you got something out of this. That's me. I'm PJ Holden, and you can find me on Twitter at PaulJHolden, or on my blog at www.pauljholden.com. Thanks very much. Bye.
On behalf of Joanna from Celsius Clip Studio, PJ, thank you so much, and thank you to the audience for tuning in today.
Thank you.
Take care and have a great day.
Thanks.